Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. Your job is simple. Listen. Let the language wash over you. You don't need to understand every word. Just stay with the conversation, follow the ideas, and let your English do what it's designed to do: absorb. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
So, picture this. It's the late 1920s,
Okay.
and there's this single government-backed researcher who basically just decides that he doesn't like the internationally accepted science of how plants reproduce.
He just totally rejects the consensus.
Completely. I mean, he basically felt that the concept of genetics, the idea that traits are passed down in this unchangeable inherited code, he felt that conflicted with his political ideology.
Right, because that implies things are fixed.
Exactly. He wanted to believe that if you just treated a plant a certain way, it would just miraculously adapt and pass those new adaptations on. Because, that fit a political narrative of rapid engineered transformation.
It's a very seductive idea for a state that wants to mold society.
Yeah, and because the state threw its absolute full weight behind him, legitimate scientists were fired. Some were even imprisoned.
Which is just horrifying.
Right. And his pseudoscientific farming methods were aggressively rolled out across millions of acres of land. And the result of ignoring actual science was, well, it was one of the most catastrophic agricultural disasters in human history.
Yeah.
It literally contributed to famines that killed millions of people.
It is a profoundly dark chapter. I mean, truly. And it honestly serves as a terrifying baseline for what we are exploring today.
Exactly. And that is the mission of this deep dive for you listening today. We are unpacking the single most important intellectual defense mechanism our species has ever engineered.
The scientific method.
Scientific method. But look, we are not doing some dry, middle school recap of hypotheses and test tubes here.
No, please no.
Right. We're going to look at the blood, the sweat, and the massive philosophical wars that took humanity from a species dying of mysterious plagues and starving from bad crop management,
Right.
into a species that can literally land a rover on Mars and sequence the human genome.
Yeah, and I think we also really need to dismantle this myth that the scientific method is this finished, perfect monolith.
Oh, totally.
Because, we tend to teach it as if it just fell out of the sky fully formed in the 1600s, right?
Newton just wrote the rule book and we were done.
Exactly. But it's an incredibly messy, heavily contested, and very ongoing evolution. I mean, when we look at the source material charting this history, it is genuinely shocking to realize that many of the tools we consider just absolutely foundational to modern research today.
Things we take totally for granted.
Right. Things like statistical blinding or, randomized controlled trials. Those were not actually formalized until well into the 20th century.
See, that blows my mind.
It's wild.
The idea that we were supposedly doing science for centuries without even blinding our studies.
Yeah.
Just to prevent our own bias from creeping in.
Yeah, we were just trusting our own objectivity.
Which is terrible.
Mm.
It means our ancestors were basically walking on a tightrope over a canyon blindfolded.
That's a really good way to put it.
So to understand how we finally took the blindfold off, I think we have to rewind. We need to go back to the ancient Greeks.
We do.
Because that is where the initial foundation was poured. But it's also where the first massive trap was laid.
Right, because when you're tracing the intellectual tradition of modern science, Aristotle is completely unavoidable.
He's the guy.
He is. But he possesses this really fascinating, almost contradictory dual legacy.
Okay, how so?
Well, if you look at his biological works, things like the Historia Animalium or the Parts of Animals, you are looking at a literal marvel of empirical observation.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Aristotle spent years on the island of Lesbos, literally wading into the mud, meticulously observing marine biology. He was dissecting animals, recording their behavior.
But wait, so he was actually out there in the muck? Getting his hands dirty, doing physical observation.
Yes, he absolutely got his hands dirty.
Because I always picture, ancient Greek philosophers just lounging around in pristine white robes on marble steps, debating the concept of a triangle.
No, he was a master observer in his biological work. The problem, though, stems from his logical works.
Okay.
Specifically texts like the prior analytics and posterior analytics. This is where he basically formalized his philosophy of how human beings arrive at truth.
What was his formula?
Aristotle believed that the ultimate way to produce real knowledge was by establishing fundamental, self-evident principles through intuition and reasoning.
Okay.
And once you had those foundational truths locked in, you just used deductive logic to derive all your specific conclusions about the physical world.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this.
Right.
So instead of running a test to see what happens when you, say, drop 2 rocks of different weights,
Right.
you just sit there and think really hard about the fundamental nature of rocks.
Exactly. You intuit the nature of the rock.
And you decide, okay, heavy things have a natural desire to reach the center of the earth. And therefore, you logic your way to the conclusion that a heavier rock must fall faster than a lighter rock.
That is the deductivist trap in a nutshell.
Wow.
Systematic experimentation, the idea of deliberately creating a physical test that might actually prove your logical conclusion wrong, that just wasn't considered necessary for natural philosophy.
Because the logic was already perfect.
Right. And the tragedy of this approach is that Aristotle's system of deductive logic was incredibly beautiful. It was deeply intellectually coherent.
It makes sense on paper.
It does. If you accepted his starting premises, the conclusions felt completely airtight.
I kind of look at this like a beautifully coded video game physics engine.
Oh, I like that.
Like if you've ever played a game with a really advanced physics engine, it looks mathematically flawless on the screen. The code is super elegant.
Yeah.
But if the way a car crashes in the game doesn't match the messy reality of how a car actually crashes in the real world,
Right. What do you blame?
players, or in this case, ancient philosophers, basically blame the real world instead of the code. The math is just too pretty to be wrong.
That is a highly accurate way to frame the psychology behind it. The logical structure was so compelling, so seemingly perfect, that when empirical anomalies inevitably popped up,
When reality disagreed.
right, when the real world stubbornly refused to behave the way Aristotle's logic said it should, scholars simply ignored the real world evidence.
They just brushed it under the rug.
Exactly. The logic was too powerful an authority to be overridden by a mere observational anomaly. And consequently, errors about physics and medicine and astronomy just accumulated.
And they were protected, right?
Violently protected from correction for centuries.
So how do you even begin to break out of an intellectual stubbornness like that? I mean, if an entire civilization refuses to look at the messy reality because they are so in love with their own logic, who finally forces them to look at the data?
The vital bridge out of that trap actually came from the Islamic Golden Age, which spanned roughly the 8th to the 14th centuries. Scholars in cultural hubs like Baghdad, Basra, Cairo, they were doing far more than just preserving these Greek texts.
They were actively working on them.
Right, they were fundamentally challenging and extending them. And if you want to pinpoint the birth of the true experimental method, we really have to look at the work of Ibn al-Haytham.
Our sources highlight his work heavily. This is late 10th, early 11th century, right?
Exactly.
What was he trying to figure out?
He was completely obsessed with optics, because the prevailing theories of vision at the time, which came from the Greeks, were wildly speculative.
Like what?
Well, some believed the eyes actually emitted rays of light that touched objects.
Like invisible tentacles coming out of your eyeballs.
Basically, yes, like visual feelers. But Ibn al-Haytham wanted to understand how light and vision actually functioned in reality.
And he didn't just use deductive logic to guess.
No, he combined rigorous mathematical analysis with systematic observation, and crucially, deliberate physical manipulation.
Okay, what does that deliberate manipulation actually look like back in the 11th century?
He essentially pioneered the use of the camera obscura, the pinhole camera. Yeah. He would set up these dark rooms with the tiny holes letting in light from lanterns positioned outside. And by physically moving the lanterns around, altering the size of the hole, hanging strings to trace the path of the light, he wasn't just casually observing nature.
He was forcing light to prove that it traveled in straight lines.
Exactly. He manipulated the physical conditions to test very specific mathematical predictions he had made.
He wasn't waiting for the world to reveal his secrets. He was actively interrogating it.
Interrogating is the perfect word.
That just feels like a massive psychological shift for humanity.
It is the absolute core of what we now recognize as the experimental method. You don't just observe, you manipulate variables to isolate cause and effect.
But even with Ibn al-Haytham planting that incredible seed, it still took several more centuries for this methodology to gain enough momentum to completely overthrow the established authority.
Right, to overthrow the church and the Aristotelian academies.
Which brings us to the era we conventionally call the scientific revolution.
Roughly spanning from 1543 to 1687.
Right, the era of Copernicus through Newton.
Hmm.
But, one of the most striking insights from the source material is that this wasn't a sudden, clean break.
Not at all.
It wasn't as if one morning in 1543 everyone woke up, threw their Aristotle books in the trash, and agreed to just use the scientific method.
I mean, we like to imagine it that way, but no. It was a brutal, agonizingly slow dismantling of the old paradigm.
Let's talk about Copernicus, because in 1543 he publishes De Revolutionibus, proposing the heliocentric model.
The radical idea that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around.
Right, and we all know that's a massive turning point in history. But the reason it's a turning point is completely misunderstood.
Oh, completely.
Because I always assumed his model was just instantly better at predicting where the stars would be. Like, he published it and everyone said, the math is better.
The irony is that it wasn't better. The old Ptolemaic geocentric model with the Earth at the center, it was incredibly clunky.
Right, they had those weird loops.
Yes, epicycles. They needed these complex mathematical loops to explain why planets sometimes appear to move backward in the night sky.
Retrograde motion.
Right. Now, Copernicus's heliocentric model was mathematically more elegant, but because he incorrectly assumed the planets moved in perfect circles rather than ellipses,
His math was a bit off.
his initial model wasn't actually much better at predicting planetary positions than the old, clunky geocentric one.
Wait, if it wasn't making better predictions right out of the gate, why did it trigger a revolution?
Because it fundamentally shattered the supreme authority of raw human intuition.
How so?
Well, up until Copernicus, the ultimate trump card in any debate was basically, I look up at the sky, I see the sun moving from east to west, and I feel the ground completely stationary beneath my feet. Therefore, the sun moves and the earth sits still.
How intense.
Exactly. Copernicus challenged the authority of the naked eye. He told humanity that our senses actually deceive us.
Oh, wow.
And in doing so, he cracked open a door, demanding that subsequent generations invent new methodologies capable of resolving truths that our biology is just blind to.
He essentially proved that common sense is a terrible compass for physics.
It really is.
And the person who really formalized the philosophy of ignoring common sense was Francis Bacon in the early 1600s.
Yes, Francis Bacon.
Now, Bacon isn't famous for discovering a planet or a law of motion, right?
No, Bacon's contribution was entirely methodological. It was philosophical. In 1620, he published the Novum Organum, and he proposed a systematic inductive method.
Inductive as opposed to deductive.
Exactly. Where Aristotle was deductive, starting with grand philosophical principles and trying to logic his way down to specific realities, Bacon argued we must go the exact opposite route.
We have to start at the bottom.
Right. We must painstakingly accumulate particular, specific observations, and then from that massive pile of data, slowly and carefully build our way up to general principles.
And he also warned against what he called the idols of the mind.
Yes, his famous idols.
Which is just fantastic branding for cognitive biases. I mean, he was basically acting as a behavioral psychologist hundreds of years before the field even existed.
He really was.
He recognized that human brains are incredibly flawed and will trick themselves at every single opportunity.
His categorization of these idols is remarkably prescient for modern psychology. He warned about the idols of the tribe, which are the inherent flaws in human nature.
Like what?
Like our tendency to see patterns where none exist, or to jump to premature conclusions based on very limited data.
Right.
He also warned of the idols of the cave, which are the specific biases of the individual, our personal backgrounds, our pet theories, the things we just really want to be true.
So what was his solution to that? If our brains are that broken?
Bacon's solution to mitigating these pervasive psychological flaws was to reframe science as a highly social, collaborative enterprise.
Team sport.
Exactly. A single mind cannot overcome its own idols, but a network of investigators checking each other's work and sharing methods, they just might.
He basically laid the philosophical groundwork for scientific institutions.
He did.
But, you can't talk about this era without talking about the person who actually put all these pieces together in a lab setting. Galileo. He marries Bacon's obsession with observation to actual hard mathematics.
Galileo is really the pivotal figure in experimental physics. His genius lay in combining mathematical descriptions of nature with highly controlled physical experiments.
Right.
His work on the physics of motion is the quintessential example. He wanted to understand the laws of free fall, specifically how objects accelerate as gravity pulls them down.
But the problem there is gravity pulls things down way too fast for a human being in the early 1600s to measure with any accuracy.
Right. They didn't have laser sensors or digital stopwatches.
So how did he do it?
This is where his brilliance shines. Galileo utilized inclined planes. Ramps. He took perfectly smooth bronze balls and rolled them down gently sloping wooden ramps. And by putting gravity on a slant, he effectively diluted its force.
He slowed down the universe.
Basically. He slowed down the rate of acceleration to a speed that a human could actually track and measure using the technology of his time, which was often a highly calibrated water clock.
A water clock.
Yeah, measuring the exact weight of water that flowed out of a vessel while the ball rolled down the ramp.
I have always viewed those inclined planes as a literal cheat code for human perception.
A cheat code, I love that.
Because he couldn't speed up his own biological processing power to measure a falling object, so he just manipulated reality to slow the object down for him.
It's incredibly clever.
But it forces a massive realization for you listening.
Yeah.
Was the real revolution of this era simply the acceptance that we should only theorize about things we can actually measure, rather than wasting time philosophizing about the unmeasurable?
I mean, that realization is the exact boundary line between ancient philosophy and modern physical science.
Right.
Galileo recognized that if you want to uncover the mechanical truths of the physical world, you must constrain your theories to what can be quantified, tested, and measured. You measure with whatever precision is currently available, rather than infinitely debating the precise nature of the unavailable.
And all of that, the deliberate manipulation, the mathematical rigor, the rejection of untested authority, all of that culminates with Isaac Newton at the end of the 17th century.
The publication of Newton's Principia Mathematica in 1687 is the watershed moment.
Huge.
Newton achieved something previously thought entirely impossible. He united terrestrial and celestial mechanics.
He connected the earth to the sky.
He provided the mathematical proof that the exact same invisible force governing an apple falling from a tree in an orchard on Earth was also governing the majestic orbit of the moon around the planet.
He brought the entire known universe under a single, elegant framework of physical law.
Yes.
But there is a very specific, somewhat weird quote associated with Newton's work on gravity that our sources point out. Hypotheses non fingo, meaning I frame no hypotheses. Which, to a modern ear, sounds bizarre. Isn't the whole point of science to make hypotheses?
In our modern vocabulary, yes, absolutely. But you have to view it in the context of Newton's era.
What did he mean?
What he meant by that phrase was a refusal to invent speculative, philosophical fairy tales about the ultimate cause of gravity.
Because gravity was spooky.
Gravity was deeply unsettling to scientists of the time. It implied action at a distance, an invisible force pulling on objects without physically touching them.
It felt like magic.
It totally felt like magic. So Newton was basically stating, I do not know why gravity exists. I do not know the invisible mechanism that transmits it, and I refuse to guess.
He was just sticking to the math.
Exactly. I am only going to provide the mathematical laws derived from observation. The math works perfectly to predict the motion. I will not frame a speculative hypothesis about its ultimate nature.
He essentially installed a giant firewall between physics and metaphysics.
He really did.
He said, here's what we can measure, and I'm not going to pretend I know the rest. So by the late 1600s, Newton figures out the physical laws of the universe.
Huge accomplishment.
But as our sources emphasize, that massive success actually created a totally new problem. Future generations now had to figure out the philosophical laws of science itself.
Right.
We had this incredibly potent toolkit, but how do we define the boundary between what is legitimate science and what is just complex guesswork?
This is known in philosophy as the demarcation problem. Where exactly is the line that separates real science from pseudoscience?
And to really dig into the mechanics of that debate, we have to leap forward. Let's go to the early 20th century.
It's quite a leap, but it's where things get philosophically intense.
The early 20th century was wild because Einstein had just completely upended Newton's physics, right? Proving that even the most successful scientific theory in history could actually be wrong.
Yes, that shook the foundation of everything.
So into this chaos steps Karl Popper. In 1934, he publishes The Logic of Scientific Discovery.
And Popper fundamentally rewired how we conceptualize the scientific method.
How so?
Well, before Popper, the dominant view among philosophers was that science was an engine of verification,
Okay, meaning what?
meaning you observe a phenomenon repeatedly and you verify the theory. For instance, you go out and observe 100 white swans, 1,000 white swans, and you verify the universal claim. All swans are white.
But Popper looks at that and points out a pretty devastating logical flaw.
Yes, a massive one.
He says you can never actually prove that statement true. Because no matter how many thousands of white swans you document, the universe is infinite. There is always the mathematical possibility that the very next swan you encounter will be black.
Right. You cannot definitively verify a universal claim with a finite number of human observations. The logic is just inescapable.
So what was his alternative?
Therefore, Popper argued that the defining characteristic of a scientific theory is not its ability to be proven true, because nothing can be absolutely proven true, but its capacity to be proven false.
Falsify.
This is the concept of falsifiability. A legitimate scientific theory must stick its neck out. It must make specific, risky predictions that are capable, in principle, of being disproven by empirical observation.
So if your theory is so flexible that it can't possibly be proven wrong, it's not a scientific theory at all.
Exactly. That was his weapon for demarcation. And Popper famously weaponized this concept against psychoanalysis and certain interpretations of Marxist historical theory.
Why those specifically?
Because he observed that these frameworks were incredibly elastic. No matter what strange behavior a patient exhibited, a psychoanalyst could stretch their theory of the unconscious mind to explain it after the fact.
They could always make it fit.
Always. And no matter what political revolution did or did not happen, a Marxist historian could stretch their theory of class struggle to accommodate the event. To Popper, a theory that explains every possible outcome actually predicts nothing. It is irrefutable. And an irrefutable theory is, by definition, unscientific.
I have to admit, Popper's framework feels incredibly satisfying.
It's very clean.
It's clean. It's noble. Science is the pursuit of ideas that survive our best attempts to destroy them.
Yeah.
But I have to push back here.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we accept Popper's premise that we can only falsify things and we can never actually prove anything is 100% true, doesn't that just leave us in a state of intellectual nihilism?
It can feel that way.
I mean, how do we actually build airplanes or cure diseases if we don't fundamentally know anything is true?
That is the exact friction point philosophers wrestled with. The practical answer is that we don't need absolute philosophical certainty to build an airplane.
Right.
We just need highly corroborated theories that haven't been falsified yet.
Right. Good enough to fly.
Exactly. But you are hitting on the deeper issue, which is that the messy human reality of science rarely resembles Popper's pristine, logical ideal.
Because scientists are people.
Right. Popper envisioned scientists as ruthless falsification machines, instantly abandoning theories the moment a conflicting observation appeared. But historians of science started looking at how scientists actually behave, and they realized that's not what happens at all.
Right, because if I'm a scientist and I've spent 20 years building a theory, and I run one experiment on a Tuesday that contradicts it, I'm not going to immediately throw my life's work in the garbage.
Of course not.
I'm going to assume the intern messed up the calibration on the thermometer, or there was a smudge on the telescope lens.
Precisely the reality. Scientists are fiercely protective of highly productive theories. They use what are known as auxiliary hypotheses.
Auxiliary hypotheses.
Yes. When an anomaly appears, they create a theoretical patch to protect the core idea.
Okay, give me an example of that.
The classic historical example is the discovery of Neptune. In the 19th century, astronomers noticed that the orbit of Uranus was wobbling. It wasn't following the exact path that Newton's laws of gravity predicted.
So if they were strict Popperians, they would have declared, Newton's laws are falsified, throw out gravity.
Exactly. But they didn't do that. Newton's framework was far too successful to discard over one wobbly planet. Instead, they proposed an auxiliary hypothesis. They said, Newton is still right, but there must be an unseen, massive planet further out whose gravity is tugging on Uranus.
Wow.
And they used Newton's math to calculate exactly where that invisible planet should be. They pointed their telescopes at that exact spot in the sky, and boom, they found Neptune.
So protecting the theory, refusing to falsify it, actually led to one of the greatest astronomical discoveries of the century.
Yes. The clean line of falsification gets very blurry in practice, which perfectly sets the stage for Thomas Kuhn.
Kuhn, He completely shatters the idea that science is just a robotic, logical march toward truth.
He really does. In 1962, Kuhn publishes The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He looked at the historical data of how major scientific changes actually occurred, and he proposed a radically different model of progress.
He's the one who popularized the word paradigm, right?
Yes, a term now endlessly overused in business meetings everywhere, but incredibly specific in his context.
What did he mean by it?
Kuhn argued that the vast majority of the time, scientists are engaged in what he called normal science. They are operating within an established paradigm, a dominant shared consensus of assumptions, methods, and theories.
So everyone agrees on the basic rules.
Right. And during normal science, they aren't trying to overthrow the system, they're just puzzle solving. They're filling in the details of the existing map.
But eventually they find puzzles they can't solve.
Anomalies.
Anomalies that simply refuse to fit into the paradigm no matter how many auxiliary hypotheses they invent.
Exactly. And when those anomalies pile up and become too glaring to ignore, the field enters a state of crisis. And Kuhn argued that the resolution to this crisis is not a slow, rational, step-by-step transition.
It's an explosion.
It is an abrupt, radical shift, a scientific revolution. The old paradigm collapses and a totally new one takes its place.
We mentioned an analogy earlier in our prep about paradigm shifts being like a generational changing of the guard in fashion, like teenagers abandoning skinny jeans for baggy jeans.
Right, right.
But thinking about it deeper, that analogy is way too trivial for what Kuhn is describing.
Yeah.
It's not just a change in preference. It's more like a massive operating system update on a computer.
How so? Walk through that mechanical comparison for me.
Well, if you are running normal science, you're just downloading small app updates.
Little bug fixes.
Yeah. But a scientific revolution is like completely wiping the foundational operating system of the computer. The old software, the old theories and terminologies literally cannot run on the new system. They are fundamentally incompatible.
Oh, that's a much more robust analogy.
Like a physicist living in Newton's paradigm of absolute time and space simply cannot communicate with a physicist living in Einstein's paradigm of relative space-time. They're speaking different languages.
Yes. Kuhn called it a gestalt switch. You look at the universe, and suddenly it looks completely different.
And the incommensurability between paradigms is a key part of his theory. But the most controversial aspect of Kuhn's work was his implication about how that gestalt switch actually happens, right?
Exactly, because he suggested that scientists don't adopt the new paradigm purely based on objective, logical data.
Because during the crisis, the data is messy and contradictory.
Right. Instead, the shift is heavily influenced by subjective, sociological, and psychological factors.
Which brings to mind that famous, somewhat cynical quote by the physicist Max Planck.
Science advances one funeral at a time.
Yes. The established old guard holds on to their beloved paradigm until they literally die out, and a new generation of scientists grows up inherently comfortable with the new paradigm.
The sociological dynamics are undeniable. Scientists are human beings.
But this realization created a profound anxiety, didn't it?
Oh, massive anxiety.
Because if human psychology makes scientific consensus that subjective, that vulnerable to generational vibes, then the scientific community desperately needed a tool to anchor themselves.
They needed an objective mathematical language to prove their findings were real, independent of human bias.
They needed a way to strictly quantify uncertainty.
And this brings us right to the dense, often terrifying world of statistics.
Look, I know math can be intimidating to listen to on a deep dive like this, but we have to dig into the mechanics here. Because statistics is the absolute hinge upon which all modern empirical science swings.
It really is. If you don't understand the stats, you don't understand how modern knowledge is actually generated.
So what's the core issue?
The foundational hurdle of statistics is the problem of inference. How do you make a sweeping, universal conclusion about an entire population based on examining only a tiny, finite sample?
Okay, let's use a tangible example. Let's say I invent a new pill, and I claim it lowers blood pressure for all adult humans.
Okay.
I can't possibly test it on all 8 billion adults on Earth.
Too expensive.
Too expensive. I can only afford to run a trial on maybe 1,000 people in a clinic. If those 1,000 people see a slight drop in blood pressure, how do I know if it's because my pill's a miracle cure or if it's just a complete fluke?
Because maybe those specific 1,000 people just happen to eat less salt that week.
Exactly.
That is the exact anxiety that Ronald Fisher sought to cure in the 1920s and 30s.
Ronald Fisher.
Fisher was a statistician who essentially provided the mathematical toolkit that built the modern scientific enterprise. He formalized methods like the analysis of variance, significance testing, and most famously, the p-value.
The p-value, it is everywhere.
Everywhere.
You cannot read a scientific paper without tripping over a p-value. But I think most people fundamentally misunderstand what it actually measures. Let's break this down like we're 5 years old. What exactly is a p-value?
Let's stick with your blood pressure pill. In statistics, we always start with something called the null hypothesis.
Null hypothesis.
Yes. The null hypothesis is the baseline assumption that your intervention has absolutely zero effect. It is the assumption that your new pill is functionally identical to a sugar pill.
Okay, so the null hypothesis is the host's new pill does absolutely nothing.
Correct. Now, you run your clinical trial, you give the pill to 1,000 people, and you measure their blood pressure. Let's say the data shows that, on average, their blood pressure did drop by a few points.
Nice. My pill works.
Well, hold on. The p-value is a mathematical calculation that asks a very specific question. Assuming the null hypothesis is completely true, assuming your pill is just a sugar pill, what is the mathematical probability that you would see a blood pressure drop this large, or even larger, purely by random, fluctuating chance?
Okay. Let me process that. So the p-value is the probability that my results are just a random fluke.
Exactly.
So if I want to prove my pill actually works, I want that p-value to be incredibly low. I want to be able to say the chance of this being a random fluke is microscopic.
Precisely. And Fisher suggested a benchmark threshold for this probability, 0.05, a 5% chance.
Well, 1 in 20 chance.
Right. If the mathematical probability of seeing your results by random chance is less than 5%, we cross a threshold and declare the results statistically significant.
But here is the great tragedy of this entire statistical architecture. Ronald Fisher never intended for 0.05 to be etched in stone as a rigid law of physics, did he?
No, not at all. He offered it as a rough, informal heuristic, a helpful guideline to say, hey, this result is interesting, we should probably look closer.
But human institutions did what human institutions always do.
They turned a nuanced guideline into an arbitrary, ruthless finish line.
The 0.05 threshold was rapidly enshrined in the reporting conventions of scientific journals, right? And the standards of university funding bodies.
It became the ultimate gatekeeper of academic success.
So if you run a study and your p-value calculates to 0.049,
your paper is accepted, you get published in a prestigious journal, you get grant money, you get tenure.
but if your p-value calculates to 0.051,
Your study is deemed a failure? It goes into the garbage drawer, unseen by anyone.
think about the psychological pressure that puts on a researcher. Did Fisher inadvertently create a high-score metric in a video game?
In a way, yes.
Because behavioral economics tells us that when you give a human being a single binary metric for career survival, they will optimize their behavior to hit that metric at all costs. Did researchers stop trying to discover the messy, nuanced reality of nature and instead just start optimizing their math to hit the 0.05 high score?
The historical evidence suggests that is overwhelmingly what happened, and it directly engineered the modern replication crisis.
Because researchers' careers depended on crossing that arbitrary line.
Right. They were heavily incentivized to engage in practices that severely distorted the scientific record. It led to massive selective reporting,
Which is what?
where researchers run 10 different experiments, 9 fail to hit the 0.05 mark, 1 succeeds by pure chance, and they only publish the one that succeeded, pretending the other 9 never happened.
It's like flipping a coin, getting tails 9 times, hiding the coin, and then bragging to the world that your magic coin always lands on heads.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And this led to a notorious practice called p-hacking.
P-hacking. Walk us through a literal simulation of how someone p-hacks a study.
Okay, imagine a researcher wants to prove that eating jelly beans causes acne. They run a study testing the link between jelly bean consumption and acne breakouts. The initial p-value comes back at 0.20. It's not statistically significant. The null hypothesis holds.
Most honest scientists would stop there and say, okay, jelly beans don't cause acne.
But an under-pressure researcher might start slicing the data. They decide to test 20 different specific colors of jelly beans against acne rates. Red, green, blue, yellow, purple.
Uh-oh.
By the pure laws of mathematical probability, if you run 20 distinct tests, there is a very high likelihood that at least one of them will cross the 0.05 threshold purely by random noise.
Just by chance.
Exactly. Let's say green jelly beans hit a p-value of 0.04. The researcher ignores the 19 colors that showed no link, writes a paper titled Green Jelly Beans Linked to 95% Certainty of Acne, and gets published.
Wow.
That is p-hacking. You torture the data until it confesses.
And the cumulative consequence of thousands of researchers doing this for decades was absolutely catastrophic. It triggered the replication crisis in the 2010s.
It hit fields like psychology, social science, and medicine incredibly hard.
Because other, more rigorous scientists tried to repeat these famous, heavily cited experiments using much larger sample sizes and stricter controls, and the results completely vanished.
The effects weren't real. They were statistical mirages built on p-hacking and publication bias.
It was a deeply painful era for science.
Very painful. But critically, this crisis is also the ultimate demonstration of the scientific method doing what it was designed to do. Self-correct.
Yes, the self-correction.
It took time, but the response to the crisis has been a profound wave of structural and mathematical reforms designed to rebuild the integrity of the process.
So how do we fix a system that has been so thoroughly gamified? What are the actual mechanics of these reforms?
You have to fundamentally change the rules of the game. And the most impactful reform has been the push for pre-registration.
Pre-registration, what does that mean?
Before a researcher collects a single piece of data, they are required to publicly register their hypothesis, their exact experimental design, and the precise mathematical formulas they will use to analyze the data.
Oh, that is brilliant. You lock them in.
Yes.
Because if they register that they are testing all jelly beans, they can't secretly pivot to only reporting green jelly beans later.
It cuts the legs out from under p-hacking entirely. It drastically reduces the degrees of freedom a researcher has to manipulate the outcome.
That's amazing.
And alongside pre-registration, there is a massive push for open data. You don't just publish your final p-value, you publish the raw data set and the code you used, so any rival scientist anywhere in the world can download it and audit your math line by line.
Transparency.
Total transparency. Furthermore, there is a concerted effort to shift the culture away from this binary obsession with p-values, moving toward focusing on confidence intervals and effect sizes.
Break those down for me. What is the difference between reporting a p-value and reporting a confidence interval?
Well, a p-value just gives you a binary answer. Is this effect likely real, yes or no? But it doesn't tell you if the effect actually matters.
Okay.
An effect size and a confidence interval give you the scale of reality. Instead of a researcher saying, our blood pressure pill works P0.04, which tells a doctor nothing about how to treat a patient,
Right.
they would say, we are 95% confident that this pill lowers blood pressure by somewhere between 2 points and 10 points.
That is infinitely more useful for actual human application.
It gives you the actual magnitude of the discovery, along with a transparent window of uncertainty.
And I know some journals are now doing registered reports, which I find fascinating.
Yes, registered reports are a game changer.
They review a scientist's methodology before the experiment even happens, right?
Exactly.
And if the methodology is bulletproof, the journal guarantees they will publish the results, regardless of whether the p-value hits 0.05 or not.
It completely removes the incentive to hide boring or negative results. It rewards the rigorous pursuit of truth, even if the truth is simply, nope, this idea didn't work.
It aligns the career incentives of the scientist with the actual goals of the scientific method.
It does. But even with all these statistical reforms, we still have to confront the vulnerabilities of the human gatekeepers.
Right, the people whose entire job is to evaluate these papers before they are unleashed on the public.
Which brings us to the deeply flawed reality of peer review.
In the public imagination, peer review is the gold standard of truth.
It's treated like magic.
The idea is simple. A scientist writes a paper, submits it to a journal, and the editor sends it out to 3 independent experts in the field. Those experts blindly review the data, tear it apart, find the flaws, and filter out the bad research. It sounds like an impenetrable shield.
The theory of peer review is sound. It is intended to be the primary quality control mechanism of modern knowledge, but the empirical evidence regarding its actual effectiveness is highly alarming.
Our sources highlight studies that are honestly embarrassing for the academic community.
Very embarrassing.
Researchers have intentionally taken fake papers, deliberately inserted glaring statistical errors, and in some cases, completely fabricated the underlying data and then submitted them to prestigious peer-reviewed journals.
And the reviewers totally missed the sabotage.
The fake papers flew right through the vaunted peer review process. How does that happen?
It happens because peer review is an unpaid, largely unrewarded labor performed by human beings who are already exhausted, overworked, and operating under their own biases.
It's basically volunteer work.
It is. Reviewers rarely have the time to download the raw data and recalculate the math from scratch. They are often just reviewing the narrative the author constructed.
Yeah.
And beyond the failure to catch errors, the process is heavily distorted by social factors. Extensive studies demonstrate that whether a paper is accepted often hinges heavily on the perceived prestige of the author's institution or the perceived novelty of the claim rather than the rigorousness of the methodology.
So if I am a famous researcher at a massive Ivy League university, and I submit a paper with a wild, headline-grabbing claim, reviewers are psychologically primed to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly.
But if I am an unknown researcher at a small state college, submitting a meticulously rigorous study that just confirms an old theory, reviewers might reject it because it's not exciting enough.
The incentive structures of academic publishing have severely diverged from the slow, methodical production of reliable knowledge. High-impact journals want revolutionary breakthroughs, not careful confirmations.
And this systemic bias strongly discourages scientists from spending their limited time and funding on replicating older studies.
Which is the absolute bedrock of the scientific method. Why spend 2 years verifying someone else's work when the journals will only publish shiny new discoveries?
It is a massive structural vulnerability. And when we zoom out, we realize that science does not exist in a sterilized vacuum. It exists in the real world, funded by real institutions populated by humans with agendas.
And history provides us with devastating examples of what happens when powerful political or corporate entities realize exactly how to exploit those institutional vulnerabilities.
The sociology and politics of knowledge production are critical to understand. The scientific method is incredibly powerful, but it relies entirely on human institutions to function.
Let's impartially examine some historical case studies of ideological distortion.
Which brings us back to the horror story I mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive. The story of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union.
Yes. Beginning in the late 1920s, Trofim Lysenko, a Soviet agronomist, rose to prominence. At the time, Mendelian genetics, the internationally accepted science of inheriting specific unchangeable traits, was the foundation of agricultural science.
But Lysenko aggressively rejected Mendelian genetics.
He championed an alternative, entirely discredited theory that if you exposed a plant to a harsh environment, it would adapt during its lifetime and pass those acquired adaptations to its seeds.
From a pure science perspective, it was nonsense. But from a political perspective, it was incredibly seductive to the Soviet state.
The idea that biological traits weren't fixed, that an organism could be rapidly molded and perfected by changing its environment, that perfectly aligned with the Marxist-Leninist ideology of molding a new Soviet man.
Because Lysenko's pseudoscience fit the preferred ideological narrative of the state, he was granted immense institutional power.
Mendelian genetics was officially denounced as a bourgeois, capitalist science. Thousands of mainstream, legitimate geneticists were dismissed from their posts, imprisoned, or executed.
The scientific method was functionally outlawed if it produced results the politicians didn't like.
And the real-world consequence of applying Lysenko's untested farming methods across the Soviet Union and eventually Maoist China was catastrophic.
Massive crop failures, devastating famines that resulted in the deaths of millions of people. It is the ultimate warning of what happens when ideology overrides evidence.
It is a harrowing lesson. But we must also recognize that institutional manipulation is not unique to totalitarian regimes. We see different, highly sophisticated forms of distortion in capitalist, democratic systems as well.
Like what?
The most heavily documented example in our sources is the behavior of the tobacco industry in the mid to late 20th century.
When independent scientific research began heavily linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer, the tobacco industry didn't try to disprove the science by conducting better, more rigorous science, did they?
No, they realized they couldn't win on the data, so they decided to attack the institutions of science themselves.
They deployed a highly coordinated strategy.
They heavily funded their own select researchers to produce studies designed specifically to muddy the waters. They pressured journals.
But their most insidious tactic was manufacturing a sense of public uncertainty.
They weaponized the scientific method's own inherent demand for absolute proof.
They argued, you can't prove with 100% certainty that this specific cigarette caused this specific cancer. We need more research.
They used the cautious language of science to delay vital public health policy for decades.
It's a playbook that works terrifyingly well. And we've seen similar tactics deployed by corporate interests regarding the consensus on climate science.
Selectively funding contrarian research to create the media illusion of a fierce scientific debate, when in reality, the scientific consensus was already incredibly solid.
The mechanism of distortion is crucial to understand here for you listening. In the case of tobacco or climate delay, the bad actors did not overturn the scientific method. They aggressively exploited its institutional pressure points.
Funding mechanisms, publication biases, and the public's misunderstanding of statistical uncertainty.
The terrifying takeaway from looking at Lysenkoism or the tobacco industry is that the greatest danger to human knowledge today isn't necessarily just pure anti-science ignorance.
No, it is weaponized pseudoscience.
Dressed up in lab coats, armed with massive institutional funding, they know how to format a paper, they know how to exploit the peer review process, they know how to manipulate a p-value, and they ruthlessly exploit those vulnerabilities to protect their agendas.
That is the precise nature of the threat. However, it is absolutely vital that we do not draw a cynical conclusion from this history.
Right.
The appropriate response to learning that scientific institutions can be manipulated is not to throw our hands up in the air, declare that all science is bought and paid for, and retreat into total skepticism.
The scientific consensus on deeply studied questions still represents the most hard-won, reliable, and rigorous knowledge humanity has ever managed to produce.
Exactly. The fact that the system caught the tobacco industry and caught the replication crisis proves that the self-correcting mechanism eventually works.
The response shouldn't be cynicism. The response should be heightened, critical attention to the sociology of the knowledge. When you read a headline about a breakthrough study, you have to ask the meta questions.
Who funded this lab? Have these exact findings been independently replicated by a rival team? Is the journalist writing the article actually accurately translating what the confidence intervals in the paper meant?
Understanding how the system is vulnerable is actually the key to utilizing it properly. Because once you see the flaws in the global institutions, you can adopt the core, unshakable strengths of the scientific method for your own mind.
Which brings us to the ultimate application of this deep dive. The history of the scientific method is not just a history of telescopes and particle accelerators. It is fundamentally a history of cognitive discipline.
It is a set of elite intellectual habits that separate reliable inquiry from self-delusion. And these habits are not locked inside a university laboratory. They are available to anyone willing to put in the psychological effort.
So let's break down the mechanics of these habits. How do you actually apply 400 years of scientific evolution to your own daily thinking?
The first major habit our sources identify is developing a comfort with provisional conclusions.
Of all the habits, this is perhaps the most psychologically demanding to master. A provisional conclusion requires the discipline to hold your beliefs in direct proportion to the quality of the evidence you currently possess.
And crucially, it demands the willingness to immediately update or abandon those beliefs the exact moment the evidence changes.
That goes against every biological instinct we have. Human brains are deeply wired to crave certainty.
Certainty feels amazing. It's safe, it's cozy, it resolves anxiety. Sustaining a state of uncertainty takes massive, constant cognitive calories.
We naturally want to force every complex issue into a binary category. It is 100% true or it is 100% false.
Our cognitive architecture is evolutionarily designed to resolve ambiguity as quickly as possible to ensure survival. But thinking like a scientist requires overriding that instinct.
It requires operating in degrees of probability. It means looking at a complex situation, whether it's an economic trend, a medical diagnosis, or an interpersonal conflict, and saying, based on the flawed, incomplete data I have right now, this is the most highly probable explanation. But I am fully prepared to revise this tomorrow if new, better data arrives.
It's about violently detaching your ego from the need to be right forever. You aren't defending a castle of belief. You are just renting a hypothesis until a better one comes along.
I love that. Renting a hypothesis. Okay, what's the next cognitive habit?
The systematic, aggressive attention to alternative explanations. This traces directly back to Francis Bacon's Idol of the Cave. Our inherent tendency to project our own desires and assumptions onto the world.
If you have an idea and you only look for evidence that confirms your idea, you are not engaging in inquiry. You are just building an echo chamber.
You have to practice absolute intellectual adversarialism against yourself. You have to actively design tests that could prove you wrong.
Let's put this in a real-world business context.
Okay, if I launch a massive new marketing strategy on social media, and the next month my company's sales jump by 20%, my natural human instinct is to pop champagne, pat myself on the back, and declare my marketing strategy a genius success.
Which is classic verification bias. You found the white swan you were looking for.
Right. But if I am thinking like a scientist, I can't stop there. I have to actively try to murder my own hypothesis. I have to say, what else could possibly explain this 20% sales bump? Is it just seasonal variation? Did a major competitor go out of business last week? Did the broader economy just recover?
I have to interrogate the data and try to prove that my marketing strategy actually had zero effect.
Only if the strategy survives my best attempts to destroy it can I provisionally accept that it worked.
You must become your own harshest, most relentless critic. And the final, highly practical habit highlighted in the material relates to how we communicate complex ideas to others. It is the mastery of the vocabulary of epistemic hedging.
Epistemic hedging. This is using highly specific, cautious phrasing, saying things like, the current evidence suggests, or it is highly plausible that, or under these specific environmental conditions, with a caveat that.
To a layperson, or in the arena of modern political debate, this heavily caveated language often sounds like weakness. It sounds indecisive. It sounds like the person doesn't actually know what they are talking about.
I completely used to fall into that trap. I thought that if you were a true expert, if you really understood a topic, you should be able to pound the table, look the camera in the eye, and say, this is a 100% indisputable, objective fact.
But as I've dug deeper into how knowledge is actually built, my entire perspective has flipped.
I look at epistemic hedging now the same way I look at defensive driving. To a novice teenager who just got their driver's license, a cautious driver who checks their blind spots twice, drives exactly the speed limit, and leaves 3 car lengths of space, looks timid.
They look like they lack confidence on the road.
But to a professional driver, that caution is the ultimate flex. It signals that you actually understand just how dangerous, complex, and utterly unpredictable the road really is.
Using language like the data suggests isn't a sign of weakness or ignorance. It is a sign of extreme intellectual precision. It is honesty.
It signals a serious, mature engagement with a highly complex reality.
That analogy captures the essence perfectly. When you hear a rigorous scientist heavily caveat their claims, they are not hiding their ignorance. They are meticulously defining the exact borders of their knowledge.
They're telling you precisely where the light ends and the dark begins.
So we have traveled an immense distance today.
We started in the mud with Aristotle's brilliant biology and his deductive trap. We watched Ibn al-Haytham force light to obey math.
We saw Galileo cheat human perception with wooden ramps, and Newton map the gravity of the cosmos while refusing to guess its cause.
We watched Popper's clean falsification crash into Kuhn's messy generational paradigm shifts. We unpacked the mathematical brilliance and the gamified tragedy of the p-value.
And we explored how to install these hard-won intellectual defenses into our own daily thinking.
It is a remarkable, deeply humbling historical journey. It reinforces the idea that the pursuit of truth is not a destination, but a continuous, rigorous process of error correction.
Which brings me to a final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week.
We established that it took humanity thousands of years to realize that beautiful, flawless, deductive logic wasn't enough to understand reality. We had to invent physical experiments.
And then it took us another few centuries to realize that our supposedly objective, unassailable statistical math was actually being deeply gamed by our own psychological need for career survival and certainty.
We are constantly discovering that the tools we thought were perfect are actually compromised by our own blind spots.
It is the ultimate recurring question of scientific progress. What are we currently blind to?
Exactly. Fast forward another 400 years on that cosmic calendar. Imagine the humans of the year 2400. Perhaps they are armed with advanced artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and epistemological tools we literally cannot even conceptualize right now.
How will they look back at our current definition of an observation?
Will they look at our most rigorous, prestigious, peer-reviewed 21st century science, the things we currently consider the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, and laugh at how unimaginably primitive, biased, and unscientific we were being right now?
If the chaotic, brilliant 400-year history of the scientific method teaches us anything at all, it is that they absolutely will laugh at us. And the most beautiful part of this entire system is that that is exactly how it should be.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive for you today. Take these tools, practice some intellectual adversarialism on your own beliefs this week, and we'll see you next time.